It's good to see you again. And, we're going to maybe pick up where we left off. But, one of the things that's on my mind is that, we as a people, we really don't know, just how powerful we are in terms of our history and in terms of our source, in terms of what we have contributed. If I'm trying to remember my dad's quotation that the black skin is not a badge of shame, but an emblem of a great nation, and we don't know that. Everyday parlance, we say we're descended from kings and queens, but we don't have the substance behind it. And what I'm getting at, okay, somehow we know that human beings started in Africa, Homo sapiens sapiens, Lucy and so on, Aldovai Gorge, etc., Ethiopia. But we don't understand how civilization not just started in Africa, but then how it moved around the world. And I wanted to take us through a little bit of that, coming out of Egypt, because there's an original story there where Osar or Osiris, who is a sort of a eponymous ancestor, and after civilizing the rest of us, shall we say, in the Nile Valley in terms of farming and cultivating the vine and making wine and all of these good things as the basis of prosperity for his people, he traveled around the world and civilized the rest of the world. And that's an actual story that handed down generation to generation before writing, from like 10,000 BC on down. But it seems as if there's always an attempt to say that somebody has started civilization before the Africans in Egypt. Like, for example, in Sumer and Elam. Can you take us into that? Because they were called the Blackheads. They call themselves the Blackheads, but so many people have tried to make them out as Semitic. Can you take us through that part of the out of Africa where we're going into the Near East, and then we're going into India and Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, because this is so important, because the ideas of civilization, all started with us.
Yeah, let me answer that. What happened in the 19th century when scholars started translating Sanskrit and working on Sanskrit, they realized that Sanskrit really is related to European languages. And so this led to the thesis that India is where civilization started. And the idea that India is where things started was very, very popular in Europe, especially once they were able to link India with what was known as the Indo-European or the Aryan languages. And this led to a supposition of a notion called the Aryan race. And the Aryan race theory was very, very big until one major problem happened. The archaeologists dug up Mohenjo-Daro, Charnu-Daro, and Harappa and realized, oh dear, there were Black folks here before the Aryan conquest. Mm-hmm. And so the scholars then dropped the Indian thesis because they realized that isn't going to fly. So they had to come with another one. And then they tried the ancient Egyptian one, but unfortunately you had people like Sheikh Anta Diop, you had people like Teofilo Benga, you had physical anthropologists, Professor Shomaka Keita, his student, Dr. Keith Crawford. So that really wasn't going to fly either. So scholars had to come with, let's find a civilization that's not in Africa, and let's hope that we can say things started there. Now, Iraq seemed to be a good choice because Iraq is mentioned heavily in the Bible. A lot of people are coming with their King James Version, And so consequently, Iraq was their best bet. And because the modern Iraqis are Semites, you could present the modern Iraqis as the ancient people of the region. And in the region, you had civilizations such as Assyria, going further backwards, Babylonia, going further backwards to Akkadian, going even further backwards to Sumeria. And it was hoped that the Sumerians would end up as Semitic-speaking peoples. The problem is every Sumeriologist knows the Sumerians did not speak Semitic. They all know this. They even call it the Sumerian problem. Because the question now is, if the Sumerians didn't speak Semitic, what did they speak? And this question has arrested scholars for the longest time. Now, when the discipline of Assyriology, which is the study of the Middle East, started, it started with an English scholar. At the time, he was Colonel Sir Henry Rawlinson. Then he became General Sir Henry Rawlinson. And here's a problem. I've got his stuff. He describes them as Cushites, and then he goes on to say, related not very remotely with the Negro. Did he spot that double negative? Yeah. Not very remotely. In other words, very intimately. And so what then happened is how people dealt with Colonel and then General Rawlinson to make sure that none of that stuff gets reproduced. When I wrote When We Ruled, I went on a major book buying spree to make sure that I could get hold of those books. So the book is called The 5 Great Monarchies of the Ancient Eastern World. It's a multi-volume book, and it's written by Rawlinson's brother, Canon George Rawlinson, who was the professor of ancient history at the University of Cambridge. And what happened is General Sir Henry wrote the essays on the anthropology and all the rest of it. And they're absolutely clear. The very first people in what is now Iraq were Cushites connected not very remotely with the Negro. And so what then happened is scholars then had to find ways of burying that. The problem is other books came out on the Sumerians as well. There was a scholar called Ragozin who did a book called Sumer. And Ragozin, he says that the population in Sumer didn't originate there. They originated in India, but he describes them also as Negroes. So even though he comes with some complicated and convoluted theory, and then you had books such as the Childhood of Art, which was written by an Oxford University Don H.G. Spearing. And this was a book I have to shout out the great Yusef Ben Yochanan, because it was him that found this reference. Same thing, the Sumerians are presented as Negroes. And so what then happened is when modern scholars said Sumeria is where civilization was founded, they had to hope that you had never come across Rawlinson. They had to hope that you had never come across Ragozin. You'd never come across H.G. Spearing, and so on. And then when the physical anthropology started, and they started looking at Sumerian skulls, they described them as hyper-dolichocephalic. A dolichocephalic skull is a long skull. A lot of African skulls are dolichocephalic. I mean, my skull is dolichocephalic, long distance from front to the back. Mm-hmm. Sumerian skulls are hyper-dolichocephalic. Mm-hmm. And then people did studies on Sumerian postcranial, which is from the neck downwards, and found out that they were tropically adapted. So they were hot adapted populations. And so on. And then with the Elamites is where Iran is today. And the people of Iran, just like the people of Iraq, they're not the original inhabitants, they're conquerors. Mm-hmm. And the people they conquered over, you could call them the Elamites, you could call them the Susians. Mm-hmm. And the physical anthropology of the Elamites or the Susians, some people call them Negroes, some people call them Australoids. Australoids means look like the Australian Aborigine.
Mhm.
And so basically, what have we got? So we've got Cushites, we've got Negroes, we've got Australoids. That's who your Sumerians and your Elamites are. Now, what these people contributed to the civilization is these are the first two civilizations in Asia. They're not the first two civilizations in the world, but they are the first two civilizations in Asia. So on the Asian continent, those are the first two. They had a body of writing in cuneiform. They've got monuments. So there's the great ziggurat of Ur, which is still standing. And there's the Chogha-Zambil ziggurat in Iran, still standing. One was built by the Sumerians, one was built by the Elamites. And I do urge everyone, if you can pull up pictures of those two monuments, they are exquisite. And the Chogha-Zambil ziggurat has got a round arch in its structure. And the significance of the round arch is this was supposedly invented by the Romans, but the Elamites had beaten them to it by 1,000 years. So yeah, so there's a lot of history there. What's more, the descendants of the Sumerians, they're called the Marsh Arabs. And I am reliably informed that the Marsh Arabs are to this day black. And the descendants of the Elamites, they are mixed, but there's clearly a black component. Do you see?
Thanks for clarifying that, because as you mentioned, the whole waters have been muddied, and you go back and forth, and of course, as you are also suggesting, they've been deliberately muddied because the evidence is certainly there. And the whole thing continues. And now tell me a little bit about the sort of Indo-European invasion, shall we say, into the Indus Valley. And what then happened to the Dravidians, who were the Africoid people who were there as the original inhabitants, and they ended up as the Dalits, I think, etc., etc. Because clearly there's that conquest. And I think this is important because there are these original civilizations, and I want us to get later on to the spirituality or the religiosity of these people, because I think there's a commonality there in terms of the original civilizations. But then there's this Indo-European invasion throughout the Middle East that takes place and transforms that whole area.
Yeah, this is what it is. There's a body of literature that the Hindus have called the Rig Veda. And according to the Cambridge history of India, the main theme of the Rig Veda is the overthrow of the black skin by the conquering Aryans. Now, what happens is there's a lot of Hindu nationalists who have tried to deny this, because if they accept this, then they would have to accept that the invasion of India is a reality, and their languages, the Sanskrit-based languages, are related to European languages. They would have to accept that. They don't want to accept that. They say that this view is a European incursion. Do you see? They want to say that the idea that there was an Aryan conquest of India was something made up by white people. And they want to say that the white person who made that up was Professor Max Muller. And Max Muller was a 19th century scholar. They also want to blame 20th century scholars who popularized what Max Muller was teaching. And they want to say that it's all a fake. Here's the problem with the it's all a fake theory. You still have to explain why is it that the Sanskrit languages are related to European. You see, you can't get around that. Do you see? Let me give you an example. One of the names that the Dravidians were called by their conquerors is Anasa, which means noseless. And you can break it down, meaning without, Nasa, nose. Nasa would then be nasal. Do you see?
Mhm.
And even though neither of us can speak Sanskrit, we can work that out. And the fact that you can do that with Sanskrit-based languages shows that they are actually related to European languages. And therefore, the Sanskrit people are related to European people. And therefore, they really are conquerors. And it plays out in politics as well. You'll notice that, you know, in the country where I'm in right now, Britain, the European elite are quite friendly to, you know, Hindus being in very high positions of political power, Sikhs being in very high positions of political power, and everyone's cool with it. And why they're cool with it is because they know at a deep level they're actually related.
Mhm.
You see, yeah. All right, now what happened to the Dravidians? Well, what happened is they were forced out of the the Indus Valley into central and southern India, where they became the tribals.
Mhm.
And then the ones that were accepted into the caste system were accepted in, but at the bottom. So they become the Sudras, which represent the feet of Brahma. Why the feet? That way you're walked on. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mhm.
And as everybody knows, India has got, you know, issues of colorism and shadism galore. You look in an Indian newspaper, everyone's trying to marry people who are wheat complexioned. And what they mean by wheat complexioned is the ones that are the closest to what the Aryans would have looked like back in the day. Now, of course, the lightest skinned Aryan has got Dravidian in them. So they're all variations of complexions, but the worship of, all you need to do is watch Bollywood films and you can see the worship of light skin to this very day. Or watch an Indian beauty competition and all the competitors have been color shaded to make sure they're as light and as European or Greek looking as possible. All right, now what's happened is due to the brilliant work of the late Dr. Runoko Rashidi, he has done a lot of work in India and has done a lot of work to hook the Dravidian intellectuals and their history and hook it up and get them to see it as part of Black history generally. And he's had some success, you know. Now, of course, the Hindu historians hate Rashidi. And if you go online and you read articles where they'll call him a fraud historian, no, he's not the fraud, you are.
Something that I also I think is a bit of a puzzle is, you know, India is a very religious place. And a lot of people seem to think that, you know, Eastern religion somehow came out of India, shall we say, bearing in mind that, you know, no religion has really come out of Europe. And the invaders of India are from Europe. Where did the religion come from?
This is what it is.
The Hindu religion. Where you know, there's the Samkhya philosophy, there's Vedanta, and you know, Krishna. I know Krishna is black. Krishna means black, and you know, Krishna and Arjuna, and Krishna is telling Arjuna what to do, etc., etc. But it's like the fact that Krishna is black is somehow whitewashed, if you will, or not made relevant. So again, we seem to have a cover up.
Yeah, this is what it is. The original religion of India, or the Indus Valley, would have been the worship of deities like Shiva, Vishnu, Sattva, and so on. And these deities are usually shown as male-female pairs, right? What then happened is with the Aryan invasion, they took some of these deities and changed them around in Hindu form. So in other words, the Hindus didn't necessarily bring a new religion. What they did was pervert the religion that was already there. And they then combined it with a colorism and a shadism, which is the precursor for what we would today call apartheid. they had that going on from around somewhere around 1500 BC. And now, it's the longest lasting apartheid system. And this is important for you young heads learning history. There's this view held by Marxists that racism is the product of capitalism, is the product of slavery, and is therefore 500 years old. Total rubbish. Racism in its modern form is 3,500 years old. And what the Hindus did with the caste system. So what the caste system did was divide everybody up into 4 groups. You have your Brahmins, your Kshatriyas, your Vaishyas, and your Sudras. Your Sudras are the people at the bottom because they become the feet of Brahma. And then you've got the people that they've thrown out of the system. Sometimes they're called untouchables, sometimes they're called outcasts. And essentially what it does is keeps the dark-skinned folks at the bottom, the light-skinned folks at the top, restricts the job opportunities of the dark-skinned folks. And that is essentially how it went down. Now, what then happened is when Buddhism came on the scene, Buddhism preached against the caste system. So Buddha, in some ways, could be seen as a revolutionary. He was the Martin Luther King, preaching against the caste system. And so what the Hindus did was to kick the Buddhists out of India and kick them into Sri Lanka. And then Buddhist disciples ended up spreading Buddhism into the Far East. Does that make sense? And Buddhism is an anti-caste religion. So Buddha was a revolutionary.
And
now,
the early statues of Buddha are of, my features and curly hair.
yeah,
Of course, the statues in China have, Mongolian features, but they still have the tradition of the curly hair, the aesthetic.
yeah.
I think he was an African person, if you will.
I wouldn't use the term African. I'll tell you why I wouldn't use the term African. I would use the term black. Let me tell you why.
Okay, I understand. But go ahead, explain, please.
Yeah. This is where I disagree with the late Dr. Rashidi, because Rashidi would teach that all these people are Africans. I don't teach that. All these people are black. Let me tell you why I don't say Africans. Think about what would happen if there's a consciousness, a black consciousness spreading among the Dravidians. Would they be fighting for Africa, or would they be fighting to get rid of Hindu power over them? Which one? They'd be fighting to get rid of Hindu power. Now, if you say, but you guys aren't even Indians, you're Africans, the Hindus would say, yep, we agree, they're Africans, therefore they deserve to have no power here. And you, by calling them Africans, you've undermined their nationalism. Do you see? Same thing, if there was a black consciousness that spread among the Elamites and their descendants, or among the Marsh Arabs and their descendants, and someone says, but you guys are Africans, the Iraqi and Iranian government would agree and say, yep, they're Africans, therefore they don't deserve any power here. Do you see? Whereas I prefer to call them the original Iraqi, the original Iranian, the original Indian. So that makes it clear that land is theirs. Yeah? Now, as Africans, they're our brothers, and we support them, and we hope that they support us. So we're brothers, but that's why I prefer to call them black, not African. Do you see?
Yes, I see your point, and definitely I'd say I agree. I think as we follow, shall we say, the early migration east, we see the black man at the beginning of all civilizations. For example, as you go further east into places like Cambodia, etc., the Khmers, as you go into China, the Shang Dynasty, as you go into Japan, the Ainu, and Australia. Can you take us on that journey? To some degree, clarify it for us on the time frame.
I don't know enough about the Far East to go there. And I don't think that we Black scholars have done enough research to go. Now, I've certainly seen books on ancient China, and they definitely talk about an oceanic Negroid presence. They definitely say that, because I've got the books that say it. Can we link this oceanic Negroid presence to the Shang dynasty? Possibly, but I would want to see a hell of a lot of studies before we go there. I work on this principle that when we deal with our history, it has to stand up in court. Imagine you've got the most anti-Black prosecutor coming against you, and you've got to be able to defend it. And with the Shang dynasty in China, I don't think our scholarship, we've got enough to deal with that yet. Same thing, what's in Cambodia? I've seen some of those artifacts, and some of them are really interesting.
Angkor Wat?
Yeah, the same thing. If we're going to say that Black people built that, we better come with evidence, you see. And again, I'm not sure about that. So I don't go there yet. I think that's an area where Black scholars need to do a lot more research. Then we've also got things like the scholars talk about the Australo-Melanesians, and what they do is they mix up the indigenous Australians with the indigenous Melanesians, with the indigenous Micronesians, with the indigenous Polynesians. Why? Because they have an ancient shipping tradition. These people have been sailing ships for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Why mix them up? So that way you can credit the Polynesians with it, you see. And what we need to be able to do as scholars is to disentangle the Polynesians from the rest, because the rest were definitely Black. Yeah. So we work out how much of that history is ours. And so what I would suggest is we need to do a lot more research. So basically, once we go further east than the Indus, I would suggest that that's an area that we need to really dig into the history, dig into the physical anthropology, and make sure that everything we say we can prove.
I certainly agree. There's, I know that in China, there's some DNA evidence. I saw something recently in terms of DNA studies with the Chinese, and they were able to trace it back, to African origins.
That's true.
That's anywhere true. Else.
That's true.
Also, the Japanese have recognized the Ainu as the original indigenous population. So again, I think there's some evidence there. But I agree with you that scholarship is needed in terms of fleshing it out, so that we do have more evidence that we can stand on. I'm sort of deliberately going around the world, and I want us now to go to the Americas. Obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. I hear stories that when Columbus came, of course he had navigators with him who were Black or African. But it is said that he found Black people in the Americas. So theoretically, there are Black people in the Americas, and then, of course, we see the large heads of the Olmecs in Mexico, and those are, again, obviously, I would say Africoid. And so there's a question of the African presence. I know Van Sertim has done some work there, and there are others who you probably know. Whoops. Oh, okay. There you go. All right. Take us into the African presence in the Americas before Columbus.
Certainly. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen.
Yes.
And I'm going to share something that any Americans watching this, African Americans, you need to see this, because this is what you're not being told. Okay, well, let me get to this. All right, now, there was an exhibition catalog that came out in 1963, and it's called the Olmec Tradition. And this exhibition catalog, as you can see, June 18th to August the 25th, 1963, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, Texas. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, we turn over the page and there's an article called The Olmec Culture by Alfonso Medellin Zenlil. And then we turn over and can you see that there's an image called Monument F?
Yes. Mhm.
Can you see that there's another image called Head Number 1?
Yes.
Head number 1. Now, can you see head number 1? He's looking away from you, but you can see the back of his head
Right.
and his hair.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, that's very significant because that is the key. That's what most people have never seen. Most people have seen Monument F. They've never seen head number 1 with the hair. Now we're going to see what the museum catalog says about head number 1. We blow it up, and can you see that on the left-hand side, you've got it in Spanish, and on the right-hand side, you've got it in English.
Mhm.
Let's read it. The colossal heads of Monument F of Tres Zapotes principally have vigorous and precise Negroid physical characteristics, such as prominent cheekbones, thick lips, and platyrrhine noses. For a long time, there was concern as to what the hair is or was, since in the case of colossal heads, they are invariably covered by a cap or helmet. This doubt could have gone on indefinitely, but finally some light has been thrown on the problem with the discovery of 2 heads, 0.75 meters tall, which are identified as numbers 1 and 2 of Laguna de los Terros, on which, together with the characteristic cheekbones and platyrrhine nose, there is a hair arrangement or head of curly hair.
Mhm.
Now, that's very, very significant. You see, what happens today is most people have never seen number 1.
Mhm.
I've gone through the work of Rashidi, I've gone through the work of the other African Americans. They don't reproduce head number 1 because they've never seen it. And they've never seen this exhibition catalog. And so what this shows then is there clearly was a Negro presence in the Olmec culture. Now, who were these Negroes? Where did they come from? All of that we can't prove, but the main point is they were there. And this is not something that starts with Ivan van Sertima. As you can see, this is an exhibition catalog. Do you see? And because most people have never seen this, they're not in a position to argue the case. All right, let me show you something else as well, which I think is relevant. I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to show you something else. All right, check this out. All right, share screen. It is this one. All right, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, it says, what can we learn from Olmec burials? But there's an article on Professor Fredrick A. Peterson, who wrote the book Ancient Mexico. And this is what they talk about, Fredrick A. Peterson, how basically his Ancient Mexico is the standard book on ancient Mexican history. Standard. Does that make sense? So let's read what he's got. Blow it up and we read. Skeletons of the magicians, supplemented by comparison with figures that they made, show that they had a certain adenoidism in the mouth, artificially deformed heads, short legs, low and obese bodies with feminine characteristics, and that they practiced dental mutilation, a substratum with Negroid characteristics that intermingled with the magicians lead some anthropologists to speculate on Negroid immigration into Mexico. So what we have then, we've got the bones, we've got the sculptures, and we've got one of the sculptures that clearly has African hair. And none of this has got anything to do with Van Sertima. This is before Van Sertima, this research was even before Van Sertima got on the scene. Do you see? So I think people need to see this because it shuts up a lot of stupid arguments that people are having. People are trying to say Van Sertima started this, Van Sertima made it up. Van Sertima didn't make anything up. That's what the data is. And this is why most people need to see the museum catalog, because that is what was put out in 63.
Mhm. Mhm. You know, this is obviously, clear evidence. I think it documents, more and more, our presence around the world,
Yeah.
physically, and contributing to the beginning of human beings in all of these continental areas. Obviously, what happened in Europe was an aberration, shall we say, because of climatology, and our ancestors there got trapped and then became leucoid, if you will, or lost pigmentation and whatever else we don't know in terms of the transformations due to a climate and environment. But it's important for us to understand this, that we're planetary people. We see ourselves in this sort of claustrophobic situation where we have been put by the last 500 years of European domination and hegemony, and we don't understand that we are bigger than that, and we have therefore the most glorious presence and the most glorious history, certainly on planet Earth, in terms of what we have accomplished as the original human beings. And kudos to you in terms of your historical detective work, if you will, making it available out there to the public. I think that we emphasize too much Europe, and that's why I wanted to go that route, to go through the Near East or Middle East or whatever, through India, through China, Far East, and then perhaps overland or overseas, shall we say, to the Americas. Let's get back to the Americas a little bit, and then maybe we can come back to Europe. But the voyages, who discovered America first? The Chinese? Certainly we know it's not Columbus. What about the Malian voyages? I think those are recorded. And what about Egyptian voyages? Were the Egyptian voyages to the New World, to the Americas?
All right, this is what we can prove, or what it seems reasonable to believe.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now there is an account that was published by a Syrian scholar called Shihab al-Din ibn Fadl el-Umari. And his book was published in 1342. And in chapter 10, he reports on a conversation that he had with Mansa Musa. And in the conversation, Mansa Musa talks about his predecessor attempting two voyages, or two sets of voyages, across the Atlantic, involving hundreds, perhaps thousands of ships. Mm-hmm. People have speculated on who was that predecessor. Dr. Basil Davidson thinks it's Mansa Muhammad, but most people think it's Mansa Abu Bakari II. And logic would say that it would have been some years before Musa becomes the Mansa of Mali. So that would put it somewhere around 1311, 1310, something like that. All right, so the question now then is, did the Malians arrive in the Americas, yes or no? We know for a fact that there are 14th century art pieces made by the Native Americans that clearly have African faces in them. And there was a scholar who wrote a whole book on this. His name was Count Alexander von Wuthenau, and his book was called Pre-Columbian Terracottas, Art of the Americas. I've got the book, and Negroes are all over it, basically, all over it. And he speculated that these Negroes could have been from Egypt or from Nigeria. Yeah. All right. Now, he admits he's speculating. Does that make sense? But obviously, if you've got some black folks, you've got to guess where you think they're coming from. Now, I think that the 14th century ones are Malians. Then we have the fact that two Negro skeletons from Africa have definitely been discovered in the West, dated around the year 1250, and they were discovered Danish Virgin Islands. And it was the Smithsonian that discovered them in the 70s, and they're clearly Negroes. So that means that some Black folks definitely got there. Now, are these are Negroes the same as the ones discovered by Columbus in Darien? Darien on a modern map is Panama. And quite possibly so. Do you see? So we've got little bits of evidence that when you put it together, tends to create a kind of narrative. Now, the Olmec period would be something like 1200 BC, something like that. Van Sertima speculates that the Olmec people represent voyages from Egypt. Another speculation is the voyages could have come from Kush. But again, this is speculation, because if you consider that you've got Black people all over Africa, they could have come from anywhere in Africa, in truth. And because you've got Black people in Asia at this time period, Melanesians, Micronesians, they could have come from any of those places too. Now, why people think it was Egypt is when you look at the Olmec and later on Mayan art, you can spot things like, wait a minute, that looks like something in an ancient Egyptian ritual. That looks like something in an ancient Egyptian ritual. And there was an Indian scholar from this country called Rafiq Ali Jarazboy. He wrote a whole book where he's just comparing ancient American Nile Valley, ancient American Nile Valley, ancient American Nile Valley, and he's just showing you, and there are so many of these similarities that one could reasonably suggest that it could well have been the Egyptians that did that. Mm-hmm. Other speculation is, are you aware of there's a toxicology report on some of the Egyptian mummies and whether or not they had ingested American cocaine and tobacco. You aware of that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was a study that was done, and it was an Eastern European scholar. And this Eastern European scholar, her evidence will put you in prison. You see, that's how tight her evidence is. If she testifies against you, you're going to jail. And her team conducted a study on New Kingdom mummies, and some of the mummies have got presence of tobacco and cocaine in them. And there's only one source that tobacco and cocaine could have come from, and that's the Americas. And so we now have a situation where if there wasn't any contact between the Native Americans and ancient Egypt, how did
there were American drug pushers back in the day?
Here's the point. It's quite possible that both of those things were used therapeutically, you see. Yeah. So I'm not going to accuse our ancestors of being base heads. It's quite possible there was a therapeutic thing going on. But the bottom line is her evidence will put you in prison. That's the point. And of course, Egyptologists can't answer that because they know her evidence will put you in prison. So what are you going to say? So what they've chosen to do instead is this. But the documentary, you can find it online, you can find it. And the evidence is tight. So let's draw a conclusion. The conclusion being, we don't know which group of Black people the Olmec heads represent. But the smart speculation suggests either people from Egypt or people from Kush.
I think what you've been able to do is to help to paint a picture of us as a global people with a global presence from the earliest time that humans inhabited the planet. So that the history of humanity is really our history. And our history has been truncated, that has been distorted, has been destroyed, by Europe and the European presence. And I think what I'd like us to do next time is to look at Europe and to look at then the African presence going into Europe, European civilization developing, whether it's from Crete or from Greece and that relationship, Homer, etc., early days, and begin then to develop the understanding of how recent, in some sense, that was in terms of our relationship. And so much of our history had gone on before that we don't know about, and we should know about, because then that will put it in perspective. Because the perspective will give us some understanding of why it is that the European now seems to want to crush us and dominate us, because initially we dominated them because of our presence and our civilization that antedated their presence because they were trapped by the Ice Age for so long. So, thank you for all the detail that you've given us today, and I look forward to us taking on Europe the next time around.
Thank you very much, sir.
Wonderful, Robin. Until next time. Good.